all of the people who've been here for a very, very long time are here unlawfully, and for whom removal en masse doesn't make sense. That's 11 million people who are now in the country unlawfully, and we've got to come up with a rational way to deal with those individuals that leads to some form of a path to citizenship.
This is the Miller Center Forum from the University of Virginia. I'm Doug Blackman. 4 years ago, a new administration in the White House was promising a comprehensive overhaul to U.S. immigration policies and enforcement. But that plan never got off the ground, paralyzed by the toxic political atmosphere in Washington, D.C., and the fears of many Americans that tsunamis of illegal immigrants were swamping our country. 4 years later, those waves appear to have crested. Millions of formerly undocumented workers are choosing to remain in their home countries. The Obama administration has deported record numbers of foreigners. Spending on immigration enforcement topped $18 billion last year, more than the total amount spent on all other federal police agencies, according to one nonpartisan think tank. Yet the importance of immigration in American politics remains as potent as ever. In the last election, Hispanic voters turned overwhelmingly against the Republican Party for its harsh positions on immigration, posing a long-term threat to the viability of the GOP as Hispanics grow closer to becoming the largest and most important minority group in the U.S. Now, amid that confusing landscape, the Obama administration is promising again to accomplish what it could not 4 years ago: passage of a comprehensive immigration reform law that includes a path to citizenship for millions of non-citizens who have been working illegally in the United States. Our guest today stands at the center of that effort. John Morton was a graduate of the University of Virginia and the UVA Law School. An attorney for the Department of Justice for more than 15 years, he was named in 2009 Director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. There, he oversees an agency with more than 20,000 employees and a budget of $5.7 billion. He's also the son of a Scottish immigrant himself. Thank you for being here, Mr. Morton.
My pleasure.
Why don't we begin with you trying to decode for some of us who've been confused by changes in the names of agencies and the functions of names of agencies. What exactly is ICE right now? And lay that out for us, and then give us some sense of what's about to happen in terms of the White House's new approach to immigration.
So ICE is the merger of two proud agencies, the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the United States Customs Service. And that merger happened in the wake of September 11, and it brought two agencies together, and it was named Immigration and Customs Enforcement. In practice, we do two things. We enforce the nation's immigration laws, along with our sister agency, Customs and Border Protection and Citizenship and Immigration Services. And we're also the principal investigative arm of the Department of Homeland Security. And in fact, we have more criminal investigators, special agents, than we do immigration officers. But given the nature of immigration and its unsettled place in the American conscience, that tends to be the part of our mission that dominates the public perception of the agency, dominates the public discourse about what we do. We've come a long way in 10 years. We're about to have our 10-year anniversary this March. And we've gotten through those difficult early days of the merger to where we now are ICE. In terms of the second piece of your question, which is, what are we looking at from the immigration reform perspective? Well, we're looking at a continued emphasis by the president on reforming our laws and doing so in a comprehensive fashion. At the end of the day, the system doesn't work well. It hasn't worked well for many decades. This isn't a problem that grew up just yesterday. and the president's committed to it. I'm committed to it. And with a little luck, we are going to get to it and work with the Congress to reform our laws. They just haven't kept up with the time. And I think, you know, the country is suffering as a result, and we just need to get to it.
But what are the components of that likely to be? I mean, if you read the New York Times very recently, there's been what looks to be a pretty complete description of the kinds of things the president is planning. One is a much more aggressive ability to verify the legal status of workers, and I take it a more stringent enforcement of that, which is something that conservatives, the Republican Party, and enforcement supporters have pushed for. But what else is there? What's different and what's coming from what we've heard before?
So there are four major elements to the president's plan. First, we've got to secure the borders. You know, we are a nation of laws, and that needs to continue, and we need to have a sense of integrity to the immigration system that we have. We need thoughtful interior enforcement as well, largely turning around employment verification, making sure that employers hire people who are here lawfully, don't exploit them, follow the rules. We need to make sure that our legal immigration system reflects the reality of who wants to come here, who we would want to keep here as either lawful permanent residents or citizens. For example, people with high-tech skills, people coming to study in our country, temporary agricultural workers. And finally, we have got to address, as the fourth prong in the plan, all of the people who've been here for a very, very long time, are here unlawfully, and for whom removal en masse doesn't make sense. And that's, you know, 11 million people who are now in the country unlawfully, many of them for a very, very long time, and we've got to come up with a rational way to deal with those individuals that leads to some form of a path to citizenship.
Well, and let's talk more about that. But first also, since this is an area that so many people disagree about, so many basic elements, but it does appear that these days there's generally an agreement that the number of undocumented workers in the U.S. is 11 million or 12 million. And I take it that's not really undocumented workers, but undocumented people, some of whom are workers and some of whom I guess are family members. But does that sound right? 11, that's your number, 11 million, 12 million. Who are they? Where did they come from? Why, did they all wade across the Rio Grande Valley? Did they all come down from Canada? Who are those 11 million people?
So they are literally a reflection of the world. We removed people to 190 different countries last year. Now, there are certain parts of the world where we deported more people to than others. For example, Mexico accounts for the overwhelming majority of the people that we remove, followed by Central American countries. But they're literally people coming from everywhere, all ages, all stripes. And some of them are coming for immediate economic reasons. Other people are fleeing persecution in their homeland. Other people are trying to come and join their families here in the United States. And we've got to deal with them all. And let's not forget that in addition to the 11 million people who come here lawfully, the United States has a very, very strong tradition of generous legal immigration. We are one of the most generous countries in the world when it comes to immigration generally. The debate tends to always be reduced to this question of illegal immigration, but we have a very, very proud history as a country of welcoming people by lawful means. Millions of people come that way, and it's something that we shouldn't forget.
Like your father, presumably.
Well, my father was actually born in Charlottesville.
But you were born in Scotland. How did that happen?
I know that, you know, in certain quarters of Virginia, you know, Charlottesville is viewed as a different part of the state. But my mother was born in the United Kingdom and came to this country when she married my father, and has lived in Virginia now longer than she's lived in the United Kingdom. But she decided never to naturalize, so she's still a green card holder to this day. She's a lawful permanent resident, and I'm fairly confident that's the way she's going to end her days. And that's one of the great things about our country, is that you can come here and you can be a lawful permanent resident, and if you want to naturalize, you can, and if not, as long as you're law-abiding, you can stay and be an LPR. And on top of that, another great thing about our country is somebody like me, whose mother is an immigrant, can end up being the head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So
fairly amazing. But also back on who these 11 million are. They come from a lot of different places, but I've read about significant numbers of legal entrants, but who overstay their visas, as opposed to the classic image of blue-collar workers who cross the border illegally. But how would you break down those 11 million people into some sorts of workable categories?
Well, you're hitting on the point that, you know, immigration is often reduced by the pundits and people who feel passionately on the subject to simplifications. And in fact, it's a very complex set of issues. It's really the story of America. And it isn't the case that everybody who's here unlawfully jumped the fence in El Paso. In fact, we estimate that about 40% of the people who've come to the United States and ultimately remained unlawfully did so after they came here on a visa. And that part of the story is not particularly well known, is not focused on. You often see a strong policy and political emphasis on the border and increasing the number of Border Patrol agents. And we now have the highest number of Border Patrol agents we've ever had in the nation's history. Yet at the same time, a very, very large number of people are coming into the country and staying here unlawfully through international airports or on cruise ships. And that's a major, major part of the story that we've got to deal with if we're going to have thoughtful reform.
And in the last 4 years, the U.S. has deported or removed something like about 400,000 people a year, right? And so the Obama administration is if this is correct, has deported more people than any other administration, I guess that we know of, or since we started counting. But is that right? Is that fair to say?
So we remove about 400,000 people a year. And that's a reflection of the resources that Congress appropriates to us every year. And it's quite a large number of people, although if you think about it in terms of the 11 million people who are here unlawfully, it's less than 4% of the people each year. I think the real question for us is, who are those 400,000 people going to be? And one of the things that we have tried very hard in this administration to do since we came into office, and that I have tried to do as the director of the agency, is to answer that question of who the 400,000 are going to be sort of thoughtfully. You can have one of two answers. It can be the first 400,000 people that you run across. That's one way to run the railroad. Or it can be those 400,000 people that make the most sense from a policy perspective, from the perspective of the individual communities and states that we serve. Obviously, I choose the latter answer and have chosen the latter answer. And that means you've got to prioritize your efforts. And you've got to recognize that our present system doesn't work particularly well. An enforcement-only solution isn't the answer. We need comprehensive immigration reform, and in the meantime, we're going to use the resources that Congress gives us in a thoughtful way. And we're going to focus on those people that are most deserving of our enforcement attention. And from my perspective, that starts first and foremost with criminal offenders. So it's not a good idea to come to the country unlawfully. It's a particularly bad idea to come to the country unlawfully and engage in crime. And we have increase the percentage of individuals that we remove with criminal records from about 31% in the year right before I took office to now over 55% of the people that we remove are here not only unlawfully but have a criminal offense. The next major focus for us from a priorities perspective is the border. We have to have some integrity at the border. If we're not going to have thoughtful border controls, meaningful border controls, we shouldn't have a visa system. There's no sense in requiring people to get visas. There's no sense in having a whole structured and controlled immigration process. And then finally, we've put a lot of emphasis in trying to maintain the basic integrity of the system by going after those who've gamed it particularly seriously. People who we've removed before and have come back again unlawfully, which is a felony under federal law. People for whom we've put into proceedings and they've gone through the entire system, which, by the way, is quite generous, and you can take your immigration case all the way to the Supreme Court. At the end of the day, if after all of that you've been ordered removed and you decide to abscond, well, the government should focus its resources on you. And the same is true for people who obtain their status by fraud. Those are thoughtful places for us to focus on. It's what we've done. And when you look at the 409,000 people that we removed this past fiscal year, 96% of the people that we removed fell into one of the categories I described. And, you know, does that mean there are people who are here unlawfully that we are not focusing on and not removing? Yes, that's right. It means that. As the Secretary announced last year, we have made a conscious decision not to focus our resources on people who came to the United States as very small children and have otherwise lived a law-abiding life and came to the United States through no fault of their own. They were coming with their parents when they were 2 or 3. And at the end of the day, those individuals, provided they have gone to school or are going to school or trying to contribute to the United States through service in the military, we're not going to focus our enforcement resources on those people. We're going to rather focus our enforcement resources on people who are committing crimes, for example.
And has the situation changed for the sort of classic scenario of the hardworking guy from Ecuador who illegally entered the U.S. by walking across the border? He's been here for 5 or 6 years as a painter, has not broken the law, but gets stopped in a traffic stop one night and can't produce identification. The cultural mythology, at least, certainly among a lot of undocumented workers, is that snagged in that way, this guy's not going to make it back. Once the police have identified him as not having identification, he's on his way to a bus out of the country. Is that still the case, or is there something that gives him an opening now?
I think a lot has changed for that particular person, although the situation remains imperfect. That person now faces a world where we very intentionally exercise prosecutorial discretion to decide whether or not an individual warrants the full weight of immigration enforcement. Again, recognizing that we can only remove roughly 400,000 people a year, and we got to make some judgment calls. And, you know, the person that you describe, assuming they don't have a criminal record and they haven't been through the system before, isn't going to be the highest priority for us. It doesn't mean that they're going to get a pass each and every time. It doesn't mean that it's a certainty of no removal, but the chances of it are a lot less than before. And simply because we're not being indiscriminate, and I've been quite open about saying we're going to focus on certain classes and we're going to focus on them very hard, and there will be other classes that as a result we don't focus as hard on.
And how's all of this that you've just been describing different from 4 years or 6 years ago?
Well, so the focus on reform and comprehensive reform has been consistent from the beginning of the administration. For a host of reasons, it wasn't possible during the first term, primarily because there wasn't sufficient bipartisan support on the Hill. Ultimately, we're talking about legislative reform. We're talking about reforming the Immigration and Nationality Act, something that's not in my power, not in the president's power. There's a lot we can do administratively, and we have done so, focusing our resources, deciding not to go after people who came as children. But that is ultimately an administrative solution, and it is ultimately a temporary solution. All of the people that I exercise prosecutorial discretion for and ultimately don't decide to remove, that doesn't turn them into lawful permanent residents. It doesn't turn them into citizens. They're still in the country unlawfully. We're just not exercising the power of the government to move them in an immediate sense. And so that's why we've got to have comprehensive immigration reform. It makes no sense to have 11 million people in a long-term status that is either second class or in limbo. As a country, we need to figure out what are we going to do with these people and create a path to citizenship for the overwhelming majority of them, and for those of them who have a criminal record or some other reason why they wouldn't make good citizens or good candidates for long-term residence here in this country, then we enforce the law.
But if we go back in time, prior to the Obama administration, and particularly a few years back, the debate around immigration oftentimes boiled down to an insistence on enforcement, the idea of a fence all the way across the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and then the counter argument that was either too expensive or impossible or ultimately wouldn't work. Part of the discussion was often the notion that, not unlike the gun control debate today, of people who say, well, there is no way to get our arms around how many guns there are, managing them. There was a similar sort of thing about in that time of there is no way to control the borders in reality. And yet these last 4 years seem to indicate that a significant level of control has been exercised at the border. And so I'm genuinely perplexed about that. You know, why is it that we can manage the border now in a way that we couldn't a decade ago, it seems? And how much of that is just the fact that the U.S. economy tanked and that the opportunities here are dramatically fewer, and ostensibly or arguably then, once the economy turns, will we not have that tsunami coming back again?
Well, there are a lot of things going on. One, the enforcement apparatus is at its all-time high. There have never been more ICE agents, more ICE officers, more CBP officers, more Border Patrol agents than right now. ICE has never had a higher number of detention beds than right now. We have on average 34,000 beds a day, which is a very, very large number of detention beds. Were we a prison system, we'd be the 41st largest detention system in the United States alone. You also have an economic downturn in this country that has no doubt played a very important role. You also have an economy in Mexico, the primary sending state, that is actually doing very, very well. And if you go to Mexico, you will see there is an energy and a dynamic growth that is impressive. And there are a lot of reasons now for many Mexicans to stay in Mexico rather than come back to the United States. In fact, we have just been pursuing a new form of removal where we don't take people right back to our border and simply push them across the line, but rather we fly them all the way to Mexico City. And as part of that, we've been working with the Mexican government to interview all of the people that we return. And we've learned a lot in that process, and one of the most startling things is that when asked, are you going to try again? The vast majority of them have said, no, I'm going to go back to my home village or home state because I've heard that the economic situation has improved greatly, and the risks of trying to go back to the United States outweigh the benefit that I see of staying in Mexico. So that's a big change. Now, some of the Central American states, we still see a high volume reflecting the weaker economic situation there. Another thing that you sort of touched upon in the beginning part of your question of why this is such a difficult issue and why, even though you had a Republican president try very, very hard to pursue comprehensive immigration reform and ultimately failed. And the reason is, it's a hard issue. It's a complex issue. Good people thoughtful people can disagree on the details. And we can all agree that the story of the United States is largely a story of immigration, and most of us, I think, can agree that on the whole, it's largely a positive story. But we can also, at the same time, all be assured that one of the great hallmarks of our country is that we're one of the few countries in the world that is marked by a real sense of law and order, and that any system in which you have lawlessness on the scale of 11 million, doesn't sit well with you, even if a lot of those people were coming for reasons that you can understand. As Americans, we have a sense of, you want government to work well. And you can understand why people get frustrated when you have a level of dysfunction at that level, and it lasts not over one administration or two administrations, over decades. This is a problem that's been brewing. Remember, we allegedly solved the immigration problem back in 1986, and we now have more people unlawfully in the country today than we did then. So clearly it's a tough issue, and it's not, although it's easily demagogued, it's not solved with very simplistic strokes of the brush.
Though it's interesting that the opportunity for something to happen now that seems more realistic than at any time in quite a few years would appear to be primarily motivated by the fact that an awareness among conservatives in the Republican Party that in the last election how poorly they polled among Hispanic voters in particular, and a fear that of an existential threat that in places like Texas, where Hispanic voters are so important, that ultimately that might be a place where Republican politics, conservative politics are in jeopardy. Now, I know you're an enforcement guy, not a political advisor to the president, but nonetheless, this is politics. I wonder, though, your take on that, whether you think that's enough to bring enough of the political spectrum into the center. And I would throw out a historical observation while you answer that. Back in 1964, it was the actions of moderate Republicans in Congress who allied with liberal Democrats in the Northeast to finally pass laws to bring an end to segregation. But arguably, the Republicans got no real political benefit from that. The liberation of African Americans was credited to a Democratic president, Democratic era, and locked in place the allegiance of African Americans to Democrats, not to Republicans. I wonder if there aren't conservative strategists who have the same fear that by actually being helpful to some sort of a moderate or compromise outcome to all of this, that in reality all they're doing is locking themselves permanently out of support among Hispanics. But what's your general take on the political equation?
Well, I think a few things are going on. One, attempts at reform have taken place repeatedly now over many, many decades, and some of them have made their way into legislation. Many of them have ended in failure, and there is a general recognition that no matter what your view is of the appropriate level of legal immigration, 11 million people here unlawfully is a system that is broken. And you have added to that this most recent election cycle in which it's clear that Hispanic voters are a very important part of the electorate, and a lot of the ideals that those voters bring are just bedrock American values: working hard, family, church. So I am hopeful that we have a window, a real window here, and we will see true bipartisan effort, and this has got to be bipartisan for it to succeed, to comprehensively reform the law. And we can't do it piecemeal. We've got to have a truly comprehensive reform. I also think that it's unfair to say that, as of 6 months ago, there was nobody on the Republican side of the aisle that was interested in immigration reform. And there are a lot of very thoughtful individuals on the Republican side of the aisle who've been involved in immigration reform for many years. Senator Graham, Senator McCain. There was a major effort when President Bush sought to reform the laws the last time around. These past 4 years, for whatever reason, there was not enough of a will to really make a go of it from a bipartisan perspective. But I think we've got a chance this time around. The president remains very, very committed. And a number of the administrative reforms that we have undertaken, we've essentially taken some very big steps, as much as the president can authorize, towards reform. They've taken root, and you really haven't seen a huge effort to try to repeal them in any meaningful way, and that's at the end of the day because they made sense. I think most people of any political stripe would say, you know what, sending somebody back to Mexico when they came here at the age of 18 months and have spent their entire life here, ended up being the valedictorian, don't have any criminal record and have gone on to university, that just doesn't make sense. The tough part when you look at enforcement and why an enforcement-only solution doesn't work. Think of the 11 million people out there. It's very easy to approach enforcement from an abstract perspective about 11 million people and say, oh my goodness, there's a tremendous dysfunction in the system and we've got to do something about it. And that's right. But at the same time, you can't lose sight of, we're talking about 11 million people. Now, some of them are hardened felons, and we all agree they need to go home. But the vast majority of them aren't that way. Many of them have been here a very, very long time. They're your neighbor. They've got 3 U.S. citizen children, 2 cars in the driveway, and, is deportation really the right response as a policy matter? And that doesn't mean that amnesty is the right response. It simply means being honest enough to say that deportation can't be the answer in every single case. There are lots of times when there are other sanctions or ability to deal with the underlying unlawful entry in a way that makes sense for the country. So it's why we want to see, as part of comprehensive immigration reform, ultimately a pathway to citizenship, not one that involves an amnesty, one that involves a fine. You've got to learn English, pay your taxes, take your civics lesson, go through many steps on your way to becoming a citizen, but get right with the law, get right with the country, and we've got a place for you. Removing you in every instance just doesn't make sense.
But of those 11 million undocumented illegal residents of the country now, how many of them might fit into the scenario you were just describing of this pathway that involves fines and other sanctions and penalties, but ultimately being allowed to stay in the U.S.?
Well, the line drawing is going to be the real challenge in immigration reform. The devil is in the details, and that is surely the case for immigration enforcement. And the big question is, within that 11 million people, how many do you try to include towards a path to citizenship? I don't have an answer as to what the number is. I mean, there's obviously some groups that you can say shouldn't be included. If you're a 2-time felon or an axe murderer, I think we've got other things for you to do. But if you've otherwise been here in an honorable way, and you're working hard, and you're doing right by your community, and you're doing right by your family, and you're doing right by your country, then I think we need to try to provide a pathway to citizenship for as many of those people as is possible. And remember, the more of that 11 million people that you don't take care of in a comprehensive fashion, either one way or the other, all you're doing is continuing the underlying problem. You're exacerbating this very large number of people who are here unlawfully. They're not going to go home voluntarily, and you're leaving it to agencies like ICE to go out and enforce the law against them. And when they've lived here for a very, very long time, that's a tall order, both in terms of the finances required to do it and the actual human terms of enforcing the law.
Just to press you on the numbers a little bit, if we think 40%, as you estimate, of the 11 million are people overstaying their visas and such, probably the bulk of those people are not axe murderers. I think we can fairly guess. So that's 4.5 million people, something like that, approaching that. And of the other 5 or 6 million, or 7 million that we're talking about, some substantial percentage of them are the Ecuadorian painter with 3 children who are U.S. citizens. So we get into some pretty big numbers, presumably. I mean, it could be that half or 3/4 of the 11 million might fall in that category of folks who could reasonably pursue path to citizenship.
Absolutely. I think from our perspective, that's the right approach. I can't speak for the Congress and where they will ultimately draw the line, if hopefully they do draw the line, but I think it makes sense to think in those terms. We're not talking about providing a path to citizenship for a small minority, but rather the majority of the people who are here unlawfully, provided they're otherwise good citizens and want to get right with the law.
Thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. What about the Ecuadorian painter who is waiting in Quito and hoping to do this legally? How long has he been waiting? What has he got to look forward to? How many of them are there out there who are trying to enter the country legally, doing it by the rules? And what do we have to say to them?
Well, you've hit on one of the difficult challenges of immigration reform and immigration generally, is we do have a lot of people who've been following the law as written, and it's not an insignificant number, and it's why whatever reform we do bring into place has to recognize that point. We cannot be in a position where the individuals who are provided a path to citizenship are provided that path in a way that puts them at the head of the line in front of people who've been following the rules and doing it the right way.
And how many of those people, you were saying before, we've got this very generous legal immigration, but so how many legal immigrants are there who are coming here to settle or quasi-permanent?
Well, we have legal immigration in the millions, and there are various, depends on the category, and some of them have caps, some of them don't have caps. If you are an immediate relative, for example, of a United States citizen, well, the law looks upon you favorably, and you can come to the United States largely without restriction, assuming you're otherwise a good person. There are other specialized visa categories that Congress caps each year, or only allows a certain number of individuals in particular circumstances to adjust to lawful permanent residence, for example. And for those individuals, the wait can be quite long, even though they otherwise qualify.
Mario Rubio seems to be doing some very good things. He has thought in terms not of patchwork, but step by step. And he hasn't fully articulated this yet. But I'm wondering if it's possible for the comprehensive reform that's suggested by you and President Obama can work with someone like Mr. Rubio in terms of a step-by-step kind of approach.
Not only do I think it's possible, I think it's absolutely necessary. This is a hard enough issue that I just don't see it getting through as a legislative matter, particularly on a comprehensive level, if it's done by one party and one party alone. We're talking about one of the core issues facing the country. And this is all about who we are, what our identity is as a nation, who we want to welcome, who we don't want to welcome. This has got to be done in a bipartisan fashion, or it's not going to work. So we're going to need people like Senator Rubio, like Senator Graham, like Senator McCain, and the many other people who have shown a real willingness to deal with the issue. And again, it's not an easy issue. There are some tough pieces to it, and it takes thoughtful people on both sides of the aisle to get to the right answer for the country.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I had a question. You mentioned earlier how, yes, the majority of the illegal immigrants are from Mexico or from South America, but you did mention that there are people from 190 different countries or something like that. So is there an unnecessary focus on, when Americans think of immigration, they immediately picture the Ecuadorian painter? Is it an unfair assumption? Should we also kind of have a more multicultural approach to immigration, whereas right now it just kind of seems focused on one area?
Well, again, as I said earlier, people tend to try to simplify the immigration issue, the immigration debate in a way that I don't think is particularly fair to the underlying questions, and I don't think is particularly fair to the country either. And so, if your point is that, oh, wait a second, this story is about a lot more than the southwest border. It's about a lot more than MS-13 gang members doing bad things. You're absolutely right. And it gets back to, I think, the central point, which is, if you really want to understand America, both the good and the bad, you can't get away from the question of immigration. I mean, it really is a fairly accurate story of America, and in my own view, why we're a great country. We have our moments when we go down a rat hole, but generally speaking, we tend to renew ourselves, and we tend to take great pride in innovation, and we tend to take great pride in the ability of an individual to come and make a meaningful difference for himself, for his community, for his or her family. And I don't think that's by chance. I think that is part of the American experience, and that part of the fact that although we struggle with immigration from an enforcement perspective, although sometimes we've had our xenophobic moments, at the end of the day, we're actually a pretty welcoming country to immigrants, and it's been to our benefit. I think it's one of the great reasons we are an economic power, why we are a great source of innovation, and why every time somebody wants to count us out, we're not. And if you were to bet on counting us out, you lose every time. And I'm not saying that we're perfect, and there are plenty of times when our political process frustrates me to no end. But I would bet on our approach, and particularly our experience and approach to immigration, over one that is particularly restrictive.
Thank you for your speech. I'm a teacher of English as a second language, so I appreciate your efforts to promote pathways for students. We've seen students come back to school or stay more committed to high school, and I think it's a win-win for them and for the community, so I appreciate the administration's efforts on that behalf. My question is about the United States offering automatic American citizenship to anyone born in the United States. And I've lived abroad, and I know that that's not a given and I don't know how many countries that is the case. And I wonder, given my background, I do like the open arms policy, but it does make that it's not a black or white. When you say there's the Ecuadorian painter who, he does not have citizenship, but the 3 children that he's produced since, they do. And then if you talk about deportation, that does makes it sticky, because you can't send him back without his children. And so I wonder is that a tenet that you're looking at and I don't mean to take rights away from people, but somehow it seems like it would make it easier to distinguish by taking away that automatic citizenship for children born here.
So what the questioner is referring to is birthright citizenship, which we are different than most countries in that we grant citizenship automatically to people who are born here, with the very narrow exception for the children of diplomats. It, however, is not something that is a matter of national policy or legislation, but rather a product of our Constitution. So I don't think that you will see any meaningful effort to change that, and I don't, we as an administration certainly don't believe in changing it. It's part of our Constitution, it's part of the way we as Americans have approached the issue. And is it different? Yes, it's different. Does it pose some challenges sometimes from an enforcement perspective? Yeah, of course it does when you're dealing with a situation in which someone here is unlawful and they have 3 children who are citizens. And given the great importance that we attach to being a citizen, we all rally around that principle and we feel a great bond, a shared bond and a positive bond because of that. Obviously, it raises a number of complications if you're going to remove somebody from the country and they've got children who lived here and are going to live here and have spent their whole life here and are citizens just like me.
Let me ask a quick follow-up onto that. I heard a fairly amazing news report very recently about a phenomenon of, particularly on the West Coast, of non-Americans, non-citizens coming to the U.S. and going to essentially homes that are set up specifically for women to come to the U.S. and give birth to a baby while they're here over the course of 10 months, and there's sort of doctors who cater to this particular thing. And so specifically so that a child has American citizenship, oftentimes an affluent non-American family as a sort of backup plan for in case there's turmoil in their home country. Are things as complicated as that? But that's also, I take it, fairly legal. I mean, that may perhaps completely legal, but is that a significant issue or a significant problem in terms of immigration management?
I wouldn't say it's at the top of the enforcement priorities. Listen, we discourage people from coming to this country to give birth solely for the purpose of getting citizenship, not because there's any problem at the end of the day with having a child born here and becoming a citizen, but because, listen, if you're 8 months pregnant, it makes sense to stay home and get good medical attention, and don't, particularly for those people who are coming here unlawfully to do that and are coming across the border, it doesn't make any sense to create that kind of risk. You know, do people who are here lawfully make a conscious decision, for example, to stay during that period of lawful stay to have a child here? Sure, of course. And is it a benefit to your child to be both a citizen of the United States and a citizen of another country? Of course. Our attitudes towards dual citizenship have greatly relaxed in the past couple of decades, and I think we, even as a country, are coming around to viewing dual citizenship as not such a bad thing after all.
But part of the discussion around immigration for a long time has been the contention on one side of the spectrum that a more outlandish version of this is a fundamental part of the problem, that there are large numbers of people coming to the United States specifically to have children here who are citizens and then to access services, and that's a drain on the resources of government and society. But is that not the case? Is that not a really significant element of the equation?
I think the view that large numbers of people are coming here to take advantage of government services and to otherwise be a burden on the state is overblown. I don't doubt for a second that there are many government services that face some level of strain from people who are here unlawfully. But I think the overwhelming majority of people who come to this country unlawfully do so to make a better go of it, to pursue a better life for themselves and from their family. They're largely coming here for economic reasons, and you know, their perception is that the United States offers them opportunities and offers their families opportunities that they can't get somewhere else, and they're voting with their feet. And in many respects, that's flattering. It's a sign of the strength of our country. Obviously, you need to channel those emotions, that energy, into lawful patterns of immigration. We can't have open borders. That doesn't work. I'm not a proponent of it. We need to have thoughtful immigration controls. But at the end of the day, there are many, many good people who are coming to this country for the right reasons. And although they came unlawfully, you can't just sort of say that the only answer to that is deportation. Sometimes the answer is deportation, but particularly after they've been here a very long time, they've set down roots, they have children, they're your neighbor, and you know, they're doing right by their community. We need a more nuanced and thoughtful answer.
I don't think I've ever heard a law enforcement officer so compassionate toward the lawbreakers you must enforce the law on. Let's go back to the audience.
Well, let me just say something on that. I mean, listen, I try to take a very practical approach. I'm a law and order guy. I was a prosecutor. And I've put plenty of people in jail, and I will have presided over the most successful enforcement regime in modern history. And there are plenty of people who think I have been too enforcement-minded. There are plenty of people who think I'm a communist as well. So that's the part of this job that you get. You get it from the left and right every single day. And at the end of the day, good government is about balance. And so that's how I've tried to pursue this job. I can't remove everybody from the country who's here unlawfully. As I said, the agency can only remove about 400,000 people on its best day. And I don't advocate that the Congress of the United States increase our budget by 10 to 20-fold. It's just not a responsible course of action for the taxpayer. And on top of that, a large number of the people who are here unlawfully, it doesn't make sense to remove them anyway. We need some other sanction. So I have tried to come at it with sort of hard-eyed sympathy and some pragmatism, and be the kind of head of the agency who's willing to stand up and say, you know what, that's right. We can't remove everybody who's here unlawfully. We're going to have to do this differently. There are some parts of the system now where the emperor has no clothes, and we need comprehensive immigration reform. And we need the Congress to recognize that the system is broken, to come in and thoughtfully work together to get to a better place. And in the meantime, while I'm the head of the agency, I'm going to try to lead it the best way that I can and get us to a thoughtful middle ground that accomplishes good results for the country, the people that we serve, both in terms of the citizens and the people that we touch. So we deport 400,000 people a year. We detain over 400,000 people a year. And detention's an awfully important power that we have. And I've been a strong proponent of the power of detention. And we now have more detention beds than we've ever had. On the other hand, I feel a deep obligation to make sure that when we do exercise that power of the sovereign, and it's an awfully important power of the sovereign, that we do it in a humane and thoughtful way. In 2004, 28 people died in our custody when we had about 20,000 detention beds on any given day. This year, we'll have 34,000 beds, just shy of twice what we had in 2004. We had 28 deaths in 2004. Last fiscal year, we had 8, and so far this fiscal year, we've had 1. I'd like to be at 0. It won't happen when you detain 400,000 people. You know, we discover people who have terminal cancer, and the answer is they're going to die in our custody. But that number should be as low as possible. And when you're enforcing the law against people, it doesn't mean that you do it in an unnecessarily harsh or rigid way. You got to have play in the joints. When you're a prosecutor, that's one of the things you learn. I could have prosecuted far more people than I did, but sometimes you got to exercise some judgment on that, and on top of that, we don't have the resources to prosecute every single person who violates the law.
Speaking of law and order, I guess, listening to you talk about this big federal agency that you head got me thinking about, I guess, the sub-enforcement folks that are out there. So I was sort of thinking about Sheriff Joe in Arizona and the Minutemen along that border. I was wondering what ICE's relationship is with those actors, and how are you enforcing them? Are they part of your mission and effort? So I thought that would be interesting.
Well, it's a good question. I will answer it diplomatically by saying our relationship is delicate with some of the individuals that you mentioned, in particular Sheriff Arpaio, and others along the border that feel very strongly that we should do more, that I have not been as strong, that the federal government has not been as strong, that the Department of Homeland Security has not been as strong as it should have been on immigration enforcement. The state of Arizona was frustrated with what it perceived to be a lack of federal enforcement, was frustrated with the high level of illegal immigration through the state, and they ultimately passed a state law concerning immigration enforcement. We were opposed to that. I'm opposed to it. The president is opposed to it. And we ultimately took the state of Arizona to court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And ICE was the principal affiant in the case against the state of Arizona. In fact, I sat next to the governor of Arizona at the argument before the Supreme Court. And at the end of the day, I think the Supreme Court very wisely recognized that immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility, and that to the extent that states participate in immigration enforcement, it is to the extent that the federal government, in particular Congress, expressly allows. We can't have 50 different independent immigration enforcement regimes. The country would fall apart. If we had 50 different customs regimes, the country would fall apart. This is inherently a national function. This is about who comes to the country, who is excluded from the country, what terms do people come to the country under, and we've got to have a uniform, rational federal policy. And for those, I understand the frustration that motivates some of the people in Arizona. I really do. 11 million people here unlawfully is not a good thing just in terms of good government. I mean, there's a level of dysfunction that number of people here unlawfully represents. And, Arizona saw at one time almost half of the illegal entries coming across the southwest border were coming through the state of Arizona. So I don't mean to minimize in any way the frustration that people felt. It's why immigration is a difficult issue. But I don't think that the answer being pushed by some of those folks, which was, more enforcement and really only enforcement as a solution, was the right approach.
Though the Supreme Court didn't completely wipe out that law or the laws in Alabama and Georgia, which created similarly, arguably, hostile environments for undocumented workers. And the notion of self-deportation was raised during the presidential campaign, in essence making it so difficult and unpleasant to be an undocumented worker in such an unstable existence that would encourage self-repatriation. And there seems to have been a decline in the number of undocumented workers in some of those states, like Georgia and Alabama. Is that an element of the story? And it's a much harsher approach than the one that you've advocated tonight. But that Ecuadorian painter who now feels much more comfort is less likely to make the decision on his own to go back to his home country, I presume.
Well, first of all, remember that the person isn't necessarily making the calculation to go home simply because he viewed the state of Arizona as more of an enforcement-oriented place. He was largely making a decision to go to another state in the United States. And obviously we have 50 of those states. I also just think it is naive to think that an enforcement-only solution is going to work. It has never worked before. We have more enforcement resources now than we ever have had. The border is the most secure it has ever been. The number of Mexican nationals apprehended at the border is at historic lows. Many of our border cities are some of the safest cities in the United States. Does that mean there isn't crime along the border? Of course not. We're never going to have a situation in which there are no crimes, there are no illegal entries, but we don't expect that of the criminal justice system. I'm unaware of any other enforcement system in which we demand 100% success, right? It's very hard for government to get it 100% right for lots of reasons. But the immigration enforcement system is no different. It's got to be about getting to a balanced, thoughtful place where we don't want a sealed border. The vast majority of what's coming across that border every day is good. Our trade with Mexico is a positive thing. People coming to Disneyland in large numbers is a positive thing. People coming to study at the University of Virginia from other countries is a positive thing. And we do not want to have a system that is so rigid and so enforcement-minded that we shut down lawful means of travel and commerce. We want to be a welcoming place. We win 9 times out of 10 when we're that kind of country. We can't give away the store. We can't have open borders. We do have to be serious and firm in our enforcement, but we've got to have clear rules. We've got to largely bet on the side of human nature being positive and then deal rationally with those instances in which people don't behave. And are there going to be people that don't behave? Yes. There are going to be people who don't behave. Deal with them thoughtfully, deal with them firmly, but don't lose your general character as a welcoming place, a place that's all about innovation, doing things differently, learning from other people.
Let's take one last question, and we've neglected our audience watching via the internet, and this is a question that comes to you via Facebook from Juliet Dallas Feeney at George Washington University. She asks, with regard to immigration reform, what would be your ideal 4 years from today? What do you realistically think will happen? Paint the picture for us of what immigration reform or immigration law and enforcement will look like 4 years from today.
The ideal would be that this year we have a serious effort that involves the President's commitment, bipartisan work on the Hill in both houses, and a truly comprehensive overhaul of the immigration law that leads us to a place where we're not dealing with 11 million people here unlawfully and no meaningful means of addressing them from an enforcement perspective. A much more enlightened means of dealing with the many streams of people that want to come to this country and are going to continue to come to this country. An enlightened approach that is also strategic. It's in the country's interest, looking to get skilled workers, looking to get the very best and brightest foreign students that are coming here, coming to Harvard, coming to Berkeley. A system that works, that is marked by integrity. We cannot go right back to building up another 11 million people and doing so in a manner that loses everybody's trust and confidence. We've got to have serious enforcement. We've got to have a border patrol. We've got to have a secure border. We've got to have employment verification. But to put to rest once and for all this struggle within the American conscience about where the position that immigration is going to hold for us, the kind of country that we're going to be, and the kind of enforcement system that we're going to have. Because as we've all seen, the dysfunction doesn't bring us to a particularly good place. It brings out extremes on both political perspectives, a lot of high rhetoric that tends not to get anybody anywhere, and many decades of government that doesn't work. And we all have an interest in government that works well. It needs to be firm, thoughtful, and fair.
Thank you.
Thank you.